Episode 8. Soldier. Friday, July 17, 2037. 3 days before, a pan-up whipped past the pyramid through the bright morning sky. The sunshine had burned off the fog. The city felt cleansed. The pyramid's shadow loomed over Market Street. Marshals stood sentry at the checkpoint, more than usual, on high alert for pirate copies of goods, NFTs and vehicles. Anyone carrying anything with a suspect RFID tag or token ID was being pulled aside and searched. Commuters spilled out from the subway. More still from the PRT system. The wall of humanity seemed to move as one. It sipped coffees, talked into luminous and red news, pouring itself into side streets and filing itself into office buildings. An ice cream van idled close to the checkpoint, waiting to pass inspection. It had a large stack of speakers tied to its roof. Inside the cab a radio was on, tuned into dead air. Jason sat at the radio console at the safe house in South City. He looked tense. A map glowed in front of him, teeming with data points. Around the map were camera feeds from all over town. He took a breath, flicked a switch and the antenna on the side of Sutro Tower hummed, filling the dead air with a low, expectant bass line. Downtown, Paprika was waiting in line at the checkpoint, hands in their pockets, when the thrum of the bass line came through the radio static. Paprika moved forward slowly, hood up, backpack on and head down, slouching towards the line of marshals. Paprika's heart raced, but their resolve was granite. Today was the day Paprika would avenge Carlos. They could feel it. Jason's voice filled the air. 5. Paprika eyeballed the robots ahead. A man cut the line and crossed the street, in a hurry, hood up, carrying a gym bag. He turned and looked at Paprika. It was 0. He nodded and kept walking. 4. Paprika stepped out of the line too and started walking towards the marshals. Across the street, Riz sipped a coffee by the subway entrance with her hood up. She glanced sideways at a second team of marshals on her side of the street, and the ice cream van opposite. 3. Jason's voice quivered as he studied camera feeds, his brain overclocked. He watched Paprika pull their horned skull helmet from the backpack. The spiked gauntlets and sharp angles of the thicker bone suit 0 had designed peeked out from under Paprika's hoodie. 2. In the ice cream van at the checkpoint, Shiv looked out. Paprika passed them, slipping the helmet on without revealing their face. Shiv turned the volume of the speaker stack on the roof up to 11, pulled a horned skull from under their seat and climbed in the back. 1. A marshal turned at the sound and sight of 3D bass lines fizzing and bristling, disrupting the air around them. It saw the horned skeleton in a hoodie approaching the checkpoint. It checked their data. All it could see was a scramble of pixels. It raised an arm, charging its weapon as it walked towards Paprika. "Stay where you are," it barked. "You are in possession of code that is against the law." 0 appeared behind the marshal, skull, hood and bone suit on too, brandishing an EMP shotgun. The marshal spun. 0 got in its face. "Code is law," he bellowed through his hooded skull. 0 slammed the butt of his gun upwards into the robot, caving in its jaw. It spun and staggered as green fluid sprayed from the wound. "Start," Jason shouted, hitting play on a 3D bass track. The low bass line erupted into a huge wave of low-end sound. Bones up," he screamed. Paprika lunged, banging a combination into the marshal's face. Its glass eyes splintered as Paprika landed blow after blow. It fell to its knees, puking a final glob of slime from its broken mouth. 0 turned, blasting EMP rounds into the other robots. Commuters screamed and ran. Riz pulled out a small drone from her hoodie, tossing it into the air. It darted upwards, hovering over the battle. The ice cream van's side rattled open as tidal waves of 3D bass billowed outwards from the speakers. Shiv stood, manning an EMP Gatling gun. They let rip. Rat-a-tat-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-tat. Marshals burst as they fell. Green goo sprayed the street. Commuters screamed and ran, but a handful stood still, pulling on skulls, spiked bone suits and hoods. They produced EMP weapons from bags, surrounding the checkpoint in tight formation, and opened fire. Marshals took cover. EMP pulses swarmed through the air. The robots clapped back with heat. Rubbery baselines filled the air. Cars screeched away. From the side streets, more robot squadrons rushed to the checkpoint. They sprayed heat rays indiscriminately into the stampede, unable to pinpoint the threats, the baselines disrupting their systems, radioing HQ for backup. Rook watched on screen from the surveillance ship, in total disbelief. Technicians and stealths scuttled around him. "Get everyone down there now! Now!" he roared. Back at the checkpoint, a team of marshals blitzed past Riz, still posted up by the subway. She watched them pass. Hood up. She produced an EMP grenade from her pocket and hurled it after them as they flew by. A flash of blue lightning sent the robots clattering to the ground. The next thing Riz knew, she was burning. Heat blasts smashed into her body from above. She shrieked as the fire pummeled her to the floor. She rolled into the cover, falling down the subway steps. She looked up at a marshal firing from the checkpoint's gun turret. At the safe house, Jason zoomed the drone's camera in on the marshal manning the gun turret. He drew a red X on its head on the screen. "Tacky, take out that turret," he ordered. Tacky exploded out of a doorway onto the roof of a Market Street office block. He strafed across the rooftop with an EMP sniper rifle and sidled up to the edge, surveying the scene below. He looked down into the pit of marshals and broadsiders exchanging fire. Tacky saw the red X, locked on and fired, picking apart the gunner, bullet by bullet, until what was left of it fell out of the turret. Inside the pyramid, Sam thundered down a hallway, grinding his teeth. A trail of proto-execs and marshals rattled along behind him. Maps and camera feeds filled his vision. Jane was down the hall. She saw Sam and froze. He rumbled closer, engrossed in his screens, not noticing as Jane ducked into a doorway. "We need the reserves there." "Why aren't they there?" Sam shouted. "Sir, Mr. Rook ordered the reserve battalions to the other sites," an exec behind him replied. Sam stopped dead. Jane peeked out. Panic had spread across his face. "Oath. Other sites?" He accentuated each syllable, processing the phrase. "They've hit 5 so far, sir," Rook's voice said to Sam. Rook studied his own array of screens from the surveillance ship. His eyes boiled as he watched the attack downtown, and 4 others happening across the city. Another screen appeared over the map in South City. Rook clenched a fist. "Make that 6. Sam leaned back against the wall in shock, digesting this. He dragged his hands through his hair, nodding. "Get your team downtown, Rook. Do whatever you have to do." Jane watched Sam and his entourage leave. A marshal patrol stomped towards her from the other direction. Jane stepped in their path and raised a hand. They stopped. She locked eyes with the team leader, overriding its routine and reprioritizing it to follow her orders, something she had clearance to do as a senior executive. "On me," she ordered. She started walking. The marshal squadron followed behind her. The last terrified commuters fled Market Street as the stampede gave way to all-out war. Only Broadsiders and marshals remained. They exchanged fire, taking cover behind abandoned cars and street furniture. Blasts zigzagged through the air as Zero and Paprika advanced on the checkpoint. He turned to Paprika as they closed in. "Cover me," he yelled. Paprika laid down cover fire, signaling at the Broadsiders behind them to do the same. Zero charged forward as the swarm of EMP pulses beat the robots back. Green goo spattered his armor. He ran towards the checkpoint arches, unhooking his backpack. "Get back," Paprika ordered the others. The Broadsiders found cover. Zero skimmed the backpack at the checkpoint's leg. Inside the pack, a remote charge glowed. Zero turned and grabbed Paprika, diving behind a car. He hit a button. Kabla! Oh, ooh! The charge punched out the checkpoint's thick shank. It collapsed on itself, burying marshals and abandoned vehicles. Paprika and Zero crouched behind the car as debris from the explosion washed over it, blotting out the sun. Paprika watched through their helmet, breath misting the visor, heart pounding. The shower of concrete became a dust cloud. Zero opened a screen showing an aerial shot of downtown from a drone. Paprika watched as 5 other checkpoints on the map flashed and exploded. They looked up in amazement. They could see pillars of smoke from the other checkpoints rising in the distance. You organized more attacks? Paprika stammered. Zero's eyes smiled back at Paprika through his helmet. I just put the idea out there, he answered. What I tell you? This is how we operate. No center. No leader. Just results. Paprika leaned against the car. Absorbing this. Finally understanding. Feeling proud to be a part of this. Wishing they'd felt this way sooner. Paprika nodded at Zero as war raged all around them. At the safe house, Jason watched the other checkpoints crumble. What the? He gasped. Who did? He turned back to his team on Market Street. Okay, move out, he bellowed into the mic. Get out. Now! The Broadsiders started to retreat, shooting at the handful of surviving marshals. The Broadsiders ran through side streets and alleys, escaping into the cloud of dust. As they got further away, they dropped weapons into gutters and threw off their bone suits and D-tag hoodies. They melted back into the frantic herd of civilians, disappearing into buildings and subways. Riz and Taki jumped into Shiv's ice cream van. They pulled the shutter down over the Gatling gun as they drove away. Proto-riot wagons were approaching from the other end of Market Street. Shiv eyeballed them, swerved down an alley and they were gone. A stealth dogjet uncloaked over Market Street, circling the smoking hole in the ground. Rook looked down at the destroyed checkpoint. A handful of Broadsiders remained. His visor snapped down as he jumped, diving out of the ship's hull towards the ground. He stretched out his arms. Short wings deployed from his armor, allowing him to glide towards Earth. His stealths followed, doing the same. Zero looked up at the winged shadows gliding towards them. That's him, Paprika said, looking at Rook. It started raining heat. We have to go, said Zero. Paprika looked at him and shook their head. This isn't the time, Zero shouted from under his visor. We must fall back. We'll get him. But not today. Paprika looked at Zero for a second, before turning and running towards Rook. Rage pulsed through Paprika's muscles. They felt their face grew hot, steaming up their visor. Paprika didn't care what happened at this point. They would end Rook or die trying. Thick smoke billowed from the remains of a checkpoint in South City at the entrance to the 101 freeway. Broadsiders crouched in the rubble, battling the marshals that had survived the blast. Michelle, Koth and Art skulked in the bushes on a hill overlooking the checkpoint. They were close to an access road, all 3 of them in bone suits and skull helmets. Koth had the EMP launcher strapped across his back. He was taking out robots below with a sniper rifle, an expert marksman. Art and Michelle moved awkwardly, less used to the armor, or weapons. Koth looked at them. He glanced at the time. Get in position, he commanded. He felt tense. He was glad they were out here. He wanted to get Prota back for what they did to Michelle, and for taking Omar. He had enjoyed being part of the rebellion, all the planning and secret meetings and building weapons. But it dawned on him, here in the heat of battle, that he wasn't sure he was willing to die for this, and if it didn't go their way, he might. He tried not to think about it. He tried to think like a soldier. They needed to get the job done and get out of here. Art and Michelle moved into cover behind a tree, watching the access road in front of them. With the freeway blocked, it was now the only way in or out of the slums. A group of Broadsiders were heading up the hill towards them. Koth recognized the gold teeth logos on their bone suits. They were a much-feared South City team known as Grill's Gang. They nodded. Koth nodded back. He'd crossed swords with them more than once in the league. He couldn't believe they were out here with him now, working together. 10 seconds out, said a voice over the radio. Koth pulled the EMP launcher from his back, resting it on his shoulder. He flipped a switch, and it began to pulse, charging. Michelle and Art stood at his sides, EMP blasters aimed at the road ahead. The Grill's Gang Broadsiders moving up the hill stopped, crouched down and lay flat at the side of the road. Everyone aimed their weapons at the same spot. The sky cracked as a dogjet screamed around the hill. It banked around them, heading towards the towers of South City. Michelle and Art craned their necks, watching it pass. Focus, bones up. Koth snapped, feeling his blood pressure rising. They resumed their positions. Michelle had never taken orders from Koth before. She wasn't about to tell him, but she was impressed with the way her brother was handling all this. All his Broadside experience had made a difference. She'd never been a fan of the game. She'd always seen it as just another manufactured distraction from Proda to numb people to all the bad things they did in the world to exert control. But looking down at the rebel army waging battle against the company's security forces, she realized now the game had bred a generation of kids ready and willing to fight back. Michelle turned as a low rumble came from the road ahead. 2 riot wagons rounded the corner, barreling down the access road towards them. She tensed, finger on the trigger. Her new arm still didn't feel 100% part of her. She was shaking. Art next to her was doing the same. She watched as Koth relaxed his shoulders, tracing the road, keeping the spot just ahead of the lead vehicle in his crosshairs. "Go," said the voice on the radio. Koth fired. An electromagnetic pulse screamed from the launcher. The kickback knocked Koth into the grass. The blast hit the riot wagon, smashing the windows on impact. Sparks twisted and danced across the vehicle's chassis as it locked up, skidding off the road into a tree, exploding. The second vehicle swerved and slammed into the back of the first. The Grill's gang broadsiders sprang from the side of the road, blasting. They cut down the marshals spilling from the burning riot wagons. A crudely printed off-road vehicle approached from the other direction. 2 kids in broadside armor sat up front. The Grill's gang fighters headed towards it. Koth, Art and Michelle followed. Art watched the dogjet fly towards South City as he walked. He slowed up as he saw an EMP launcher fire from the towers, hitting the dogjet and sending it into a tailspin. He came to a stop and opened his visor. The aircraft dived as lightning danced on its shell. It crashed down between the buildings. He felt good doing this. Fighting back. And he could feel that the rest of the city felt the same. The next thing he felt was the wind leaving his lungs. A boiling hot weight landed on his back. He rolled as he fell, coming up for air to see a burning marshal on top of him. "Art!" Michelle screamed. Art struggled as the robot rained blows down upon him, eyes glowing inside its flaming head. Metal fists battered him. He tried to cover his face. A plume of green liquid kicked up from the robot's chest as the other broadsiders fired. But the marshal kept punching. Its fists came up bloody. It finally stopped as Michelle reached it, throwing a hook with her augmented arm, caving in the robot's skull with her new and improved fist. Koth and Michelle stared down at Art. His body was limp and bloody. His face pulverized. Smoke rose from his armor. "Is he dead?" Koth asked. Michelle bent down, feeling for Art's pulse. Paprika was trapped by heat blasts coming from all sides before they could get anywhere near Rook and the stealths. Martial reinforcements had arrived to support the pitch-black warriors falling from the sky. They had Paprika surrounded. They aimed. Zero was nowhere to be seen. Paprika ducked into a narrow spot between 2 concrete barriers, sheltering from the circle of robots closing in. Paprika blasted over the barriers at them, firing wildly. The robots answered. Heat rays slammed into the barriers. A fireball caught Paprika's glove, knocking the EMP blaster out of their hand. The robots, thinking as one connected mind, tightened the circle. Paprika had nowhere to run. So instead, they jumped. Paprika's bone suit kicked into gear, launching them 10 feet up into the air as the swarm of robots closed in around the EMP grenade they had left on the ground. BADOOOOM. Blue light erupted into the scrum. Paprika shielded their eyes as they landed and rolled onto their side. Robots lay around them, convulsing as sparks lay waste to their circuitry. Paprika felt hands grabbing their armor from behind, picking them up. "You good?" Zero said, helping Paprika to their feet. Paprika nodded, deeply grateful he was here. That he'd stayed to fight. Another wave of marshals was moving in. It was time to go. They darted through crossfire, caked in dust from the checkpoint blast, weaving through the abandoned vehicles and frantic crowds towards the city's edge on the water. They approached the ferry building across from Market Street. The Bay Bridge loomed large behind it. "Jason, we need a way out of here," Zero yelled. At the safe house, Jason studied his checkerboard of screens, making calculations. "Get to West Oakland Station," he said. "There's a maglev freight train coming through there in 10 minutes. It's not stopping. But if you can jump on it, they can't stop it easily, and they ain't catching it in riot wagons." He dropped a pin on the map. A blue line appeared highlighting a route there from Market Street. Paprika looked at the map. "West Oakland?" Paprika exclaimed. "It's too far. It's the only way out." Jason barked. "They've got roadblocks everywhere else." "Let's get to a PRT," Zero said. They made it past the ferry building into a waiting PRT, the network of personal rapid transit pods which ran through the city on the old tram lines. Paprika fired up the self-driving pod while Zero crouched in a seat, laying down cover fire as a squadron of marshals approached. Paprika set the destination and the PRT hurtled forward, letting out an electric whine. The pod ascended onto the network of tracks suspended above the street. The tracker drone that Riz had deployed was still following them. As they rose from the street, the city came into view. 6 columns of smoke and fire rose from the skyline. Pan-ups and dog jets buzzed around each pyre. Emergency lights flashed, reflecting off the buildings. Sirens wailed. The hunchbacked hexacopter hung above Sutro Tower, now completely uncloaked. Paprika smiled, catching their breath, feeling their strength return. They hadn't managed to kill Rook, but they had wounded Proto today. They had sent a message. A gust of sadness hit. Carlos would have been proud. Maybe even Dad too. The PRT snaked onto the Bay Bridge, which stretched across the San Francisco Bay to Oakland. They were on a PRT-only track, tacked to the side of the bridge. Riot wagons couldn't reach them here. The pod sped up as they cruised high over the bay's choppy waters. Zero looked past Paprika at something. "Over there," he said, leveling the barrel of his EMP shotgun. Paprika turned. A dog jet was flying low over the track, stalking them. A door on the craft's side slid open, revealing a marshal squadron inside. The marshals leaned out, baying for blood as they closed in. The dog jet came into range and 2 marshals dived from the craft, landing on the PRT's glass roof with a thump. One of them climbed around, getting close to Paprika, eyeing them through the glass. Paprika stared back. The robot balled its fist. Spack! It jabbed a crack in the glass. Paprika flinched. Spack! Green steam snorted from the robot's face vents as it jabbed harder. The fissure in the glass widened. Paprika's eyes narrowed through their helmet. Scratch! Paprika punched back at the robot through the fractured glass. The marshal's head snapped back. It slipped, falling under the carriage with a bone-chilling crunch. The second marshal climbed onto the glass roof. It yanked open the emergency hatch at the top. Zero aimed the EMP shotgun and fired. Goo and chunks of robot rained down. Zero passed Paprika an EMP handgun. They looked up at the dog jet above them and started blasting. Back at the Market Street checkpoint, Rook and his team of stealths had mopped up the last Broadsiders. The squadron leader from the dog jet chasing Paprika and Zero popped up on a screen. "We have 2 suspects in skull helmets escaping on a PRT across the Bay Bridge. They are armed and engaged with my team. Requesting immediate backup." Rook's tinted black visor opened. He zoomed in on the action unfolding behind the squad leader, focusing on the grainy image of a figure in a horned skull helmet. It was Warhead. He looked out at the bridge and motioned to his team. They followed him back to the dog jet. It cloaked as it took off. As the ship departed, a riot wagon pulled up. The passenger door opened. Jane shielded her eyes as she watched the stealth dog jet shimmer, becoming a shadow as it headed out towards the bridge. She wished she had the security clearance to stop stealths and dog jets, but only the marshals she had brought with her were under her command, and they could be commandeered at by Rook or a higher-ranking security operative at any moment. She had to move fast. She looked at her marshal driver. "Follow that shadow." Paprika and Zero exchanged fire with the dog jet as their pod whipped along the side of the hulking bridge. The thrum of dogjet rotors, clacking crossfire and screaming wind and was deafening. EMP pulses and ads rays flew back and forth. Cars on the bridge veered as drivers rubbernecked to watch the chase. The glass shell of the PRT cracked and finally shattered under the barrage of heat blasts. Paprika and Zero took cover under the seats as the wind ripped away chunks of glass. A heat ray caught Paprika in the shoulder. They winced, holding onto the seats for dear life. Back at the safe house, Jason watched the carnage unfolding. "This is suicide, Jason," Paprika crackled through the radio. "We need backup." Jason shook his head. "Negatory. There's too much heat on you. I can't compromise the other teams." Riz, Taki and Shiv were still in the ice cream van, making their getaway through the side streets and alleys downtown. They had the radio on in the cab. "Jason, we won't make it," Paprika pleaded. "You're gonna have to," Jason responded. Shiv pouted, shaking their head. They looked at Riz. Riz nodded. Taki whipped his hair, thinking for a second, before nodding too. Shiv saw a street that would lead them up onto the Bay Bridge. They locked up the wheel and the van swerved towards it. The situation in the PRT was getting worse. Marshals were dropping into the pod from the dogjet above, clinging to the sides of the vehicle and diving onto the seats. Paprika wrestled on the floor with a robot. Zero fended off as many as he could with the shotgun. Paprika got to their feet, grappling with the marshal, managing to swing it round, pushing it over the edge of the pod into the waters far below. The squad leader set the dogjet to follow its position on autopilot, climbed to the edge of the craft and dived headfirst at the PRT. The robot sailed over the other marshals and slammed into Paprika, knocking them back into the control console. As they fell, Paprika hit Zero, who lost his grip on the shotgun. It flew out of his hand, over the side of the pod and into the bay. Paprika struggled, winded, locked in combat with the squad leader. The robot squashed Paprika's helmet into the console. Zero jumped on the robot, pulling into a headlock. As Paprika tried to prise themselves free, something on the console caught their eye. They reached out and punched at a button. A map opened, floating in front of Paprika. They moved the line showing their course, rerouting it. The PRT clunked and jolted. It changed tracks as it approached Yerba Buena Island, a small rock that sat in the middle of the bay. The pod veered onto another line, dipping into a low tunnel that ran through the island. By the time the marshals hanging from the sides of the pod turned, it was too late. The robots clinging to the train hit the tunnel walls like flies on a windshield. Green goo spattered in every direction, splashing Paprika's visor. The dogjet exploded into a fireball as it slammed into the wall above the tunnel, filling the pod with flames, burning several of the robots that were still standing. Paprika and Zero pressed themselves close to the floor, escaping the lashes of fire. The PRT plunged on into the darkness of the tunnel. Jason watched from the safe house as the camera feeds cut out. Riz's drone had gone down too. Even the feed inside the PRT was useless in the dark. Over the radio he heard the cracking of limbs. Shots were fired. Voices cried out. He held his breath. A white dot appeared on the PRT camera feed. It grew larger. The tunnel's mouth widened, illuminating the wrecked shell of the PRT as it rolled back into daylight. Jason punched the air when he saw his friends, still standing. Paprika and Zero stood back to back as the pod emerged. They were knee-deep in robot guts, wheezing. Their armor was shredded, their visors cracked, their raised fists covered in green blood. But they were victorious. West Oakland Station was coming up ahead. "We made it," gasped Paprika. "Not yet," said Zero. A fleet of red and white riot wagons was blocking the tracks ahead. Paprika's heart sunk. They had nothing left. "Jason, please," Paprika said into the radio. "We here, homie." "Look left," answered Shiv. Paprika's eyes lit up as they saw the ice cream van teeter around a corner, way too fast for a vehicle of its size. Ice cream van music plinking gaily. The van barreled toward the security blockade. The marshals turned on it and started firing. The ice cream van music gave way to a huge 3D bass drop, rippling outwards and pushing the robots back. Riz leaned out of the van, hanging on with one hand, dodging heat blasts while Taki picked off as many robots as he could with the Gatling gun. Riz held a remote charge, the same type Zero had used to take out the checkpoint. Shiv accelerated. Jason's voice came over the radio. "Shiv, what are you doing?" he thundered. I said. Shiv muted the radio. The ice cream van careened past the checkpoint. Marshals fired. Base shook everything. Riz tossed the charge. Darts of heat scolded her. She fell to the floor of the van as they sped away. She opened a screen connected to the remote charge and looked back at the blockade. Boom! Fire, slime, and metal filled the air as Zero and Paprika's PRT shot headlong into the burning remnants of the blockade. They held tight to the seats inside the carriage. The PRT skittered off the torn-up tracks, through the flames into the street. It smashed into the wall of a bus shelter in front of West Oakland Station. The station was run entirely by AI, which is why it was deserted. Paprika peeked around the stairwell, onto the platform. All clear. Paprika limped around the corner onto the station platform with Zero propped up on their shoulder. Both were bashed up from the crash. Their airbags deflated back into their suits. A marshal jumped out from the shadows. Paprika and Zero froze. The robots circled them, gun charging. Paprika exploded forward, hooking the elbow spike on their bone suit into the marshal's neck. It reeled back, pissing green fluid from its throat, head barely attached to its body, firing wildly. Zero sprung at it, throwing a right uppercut with all he had, tearing the robot's head clean off. The head sailed over the platform's glass wall onto the street below, clattering like a tin can on the pavement. Zero turned to Paprika, letting out a sigh. He took his skull helmet off. Dreads fell about him. He was beaming at Paprika, breathing hard, sweat running down his face. Adrenaline coursed through him. His glasses were misted up. "I've waited a long time to do that," he said. Paprika smiled back with their eyes. Helmet still on. Then Paprika saw it. "Look out!" Zero turned to see the marshal's decapitated head flying back at him. It smashed through the glass wall, into his face. His glasses and nose shattered. He fell backwards onto the train platform. Paprika looked out to where the head had come from, paralyzed with fear. They could feel something. A presence. Behind them a pair of black metal hands uncloaked, throwing Paprika to the ground. They looked up at the stealth pinning them. It put its foot on Paprika's chest and aimed its cannon at their face. Rook stepped onto the train platform as he uncloaked. He opened his visor, looking at Paprika staring back at him through theirs. Then he saw Zero. He stared at him for a long time. Like he was an old friend. Like there was a long history. Paprika felt horror wash over them. Zero looked up, wheezing, winded, blood seeping from his nose and eyes. His hands trembled as he wiped the shattered remains of his eyeglasses from his face. Rook looked down at the shards of glass from the broken wall, scattered across the platform. He took his time selecting a long, jagged shard, and picked it up, calmly nodding at Zero. Zero staggered to his feet. He limped, backing away, but the platform ended behind him. There was nowhere to go. Rooks took a swift, calculated step forward as his arm snapped out. He tore open Zero's bone suit, thrusting the glass shard into Zero's chest with a squelch. Zero's entire body tensed in a spasm. Rook put his other hand on Zero's shoulder and pulled the glass shard back out. Zero crumpled backwards onto the floor. Paprika tried to move, to scream. They could only choke. Rook turned to Paprika with a shard of bloody glass in his hand. "Told you last time," he said. "You're next." He walked towards Paprika slowly with the bloody spike of glass. The stealth put the entire weight of its boot on Paprika's chest. They could barely breathe. "That's enough," screamed a voice. Rook spun. Jane stood on the platform. She looked around, absorbing the gory scene, heart racing. She stared at Rook, her eyes ablaze. But she had never seen anything like this. The boardroom was her territory. This was his. She was shaking. She was frightened. He could smell it. "Yeah," said Rook. "Says who?" He moved toward Jane. She breathed harder. Paprika watched Rook and Jane square off. The stealth with its foot on Paprika watched too. A glint of sunlight caught on something silver in the distance beyond the platform and Zero's lifeless body, distracting Paprika. They squinted at an orb shimmering far away in the heat coming off the tracks, growing larger. The freight train. This won't solve anything, Jane said, motioning to the bodies on the platform, trying to make Rook see sense. But Paprika could see he was way past talking about this. He grabbed Jane by the throat. She gasped in shock, struggling. Maybe I should do you in all, he said to Jane with a grin. That'd solve something, wouldn't it? Paprika thrashed and writhed as Jane tried to fight back. Rook laughed as he lifted Jane off the ground by her neck. Paprika looked at the oncoming train, then up at the stealth pinning them, who was still watching Rook. They tried to think. Paprika turned as Zero opened his eyes. He was shaking. Blood trickled from his mouth as he wheezed, trying to speak. Paprika's heart broke. NNGH. Paprika, he croaked, reaching out a hand. His trembling palm opened. He was holding an EMP grenade. NNK, he sputtered, finish it. Zero extended his hand, passing the torch. Paprika hesitated. They realized what he was asking. Zero knew that Paprika wanted revenge on Rook, more than anything. But he was asking, as he had at Sutro Tower, for Paprika to finish the fight against Prota. To step into his shoes. To lead the way he did. To use everything he had taught Paprika to carry this movement forward. Paprika looked at Rook. If Paprika didn't take the chance to end Rook now, they may never get it again. But if they did try to kill him, they could easily die in the process, or be captured too. Paprika could either take their only possible chance to fight Rook and avenge Carlos, or they could do what Zero was asking. The stealth looked down at Paprika and Zero. It raised its arm to fire. Paprika snatched the grenade from Zero's hand, bucked, reached up and pasted the grenade into the stealth's stomach. The grenade pulsed, magnetizing, squealing as it charged. Rook turned as the stealth staggered back towards him. Paprika jumped to their feet, backing away from the stealth. Rook let go of Jane and did an about turn, facing Paprika. The stealth turned, stumbling toward Rook, trying to prise the EMP from its gut. It was no use. There was no time. It looked up at Rook and kaboom! The blue cloud burst through Jane, Rook, and the stealth to the ground as the maglev freight train thundered through the station. Paprika took in the scene in around them as the train screamed past. Jane was on the ground, wheezing, in shock. Rook was out cold, his suit bricked. The stealth was offline. Paprika could hear more robots clattering up the stairs. They saw a piece of glass they could drive into Rook's back, but they looked at Zero through their visor. He gasped, looking in the direction of the robot squadron running up the stairs. He was drowning, blood filling his lungs. Paprika knew he was beyond saving. They felt their heart being ripped apart for the second time in a week. NNK. Go. G go. G. Zero sputtered. And then he closed his eyes. He was gone. Paprika looked at him a second longer. Tears started to well in Paprika's eyes as it dawned on them. They no longer had a choice. They let out a scream, turning and rushing after the train, sprinting as fast as they could down the platform. They grasped a handle on the side of the train as it picked back up to full speed. The gecko grip in their armor gloves stuck fast. Their legs left the ground as the train howled away in a blur. Paprika would finish this. Sam stared out at the city from the boardroom. Lost. Smoke continued to rise from the fallen checkpoints. Sirens filled the air. The streets felt tense, even from this height. He popped another pill. He was sweaty and pale. He swallowed the pill with a tumbler of whiskey, grinding his teeth. The doors swung open. Rook and Jane burst in, fresh from the fight, racing to get to him first, shouting over each other. The marshals on guard in the room watched, their ears twitching like Dobermans. Both Rook and Jane had been trying to contact Sam from the road, but he hadn't taken any calls or communicated with either of them, worried he might say something incriminating on a digital channel. He was also unsure about which of them to trust, and whose counsel to take. He wanted to hear from them face to face. He tried to kill me. Jane shrieked. She followed us. Jeopardized this whole operation. Rook yelled. Quiet, please. Sam bellowed. Both of you. He let the silence hang, reminding them who was in control. Jane? He said finally. Jane composed herself. She cleared her throat, ready to make her case. She looked at Sam. This is madness, she began. People everywhere are turning against us. We can't solve this with force. This city is becoming a hornet's nest and all we're doing is making it war. It was Zero MC, Rook interrupted. Sam did a double take at Rook as he uttered Zero's name. An old wound opened. Jane saw Sam's reaction and deflated. She knew how Sam felt about Zero, his chief critic. She sat down, shaking her head in her hands, ceding the floor to Rook. What? Sam asked in disbelief. What has he got to do with? He organized everything, said Rook, cutting him off. Got connected somehow to Warhead, the person who hacked Broadside. It weren't that Carlos kid. Warhead is someone else. One of his mates. The one that burned my face in Marin. Rook paused, taking a deep breath. Anyway, Zero is dead, he went on. I almost had Warhead and all, until she showed up. She let Warhead get away. Rook pointed a finger at Jane, getting in her face, then turned and walked to the windows again, trying to calm down. Sam looked at Jane. Jane, is this true? He asked. Yes, it's true, Jane said calmly. I did it for you, Sam. I'm trying to save us. What we built. I'm trying to save you from yourself. Don't you see? This isn't how you win. Jane pointed in Rook's direction. She was losing this, losing Sam's trust, and she didn't know what that would mean for her, or the city. She took another deep breath. This is wrong, she said assertively. What we're doing, what you're doing, is wrong. You think I like people dying? Sam interjected, motioning to the windows. You think I want this? You have no idea. No idea the things I sacrificed to protect, to stop all this from. He trailed off, his voice breaking a little. Jane saw it. His worst fear. It was hard to remember sometimes that despite all Sam was, he was terrified of things changing. He stared back. This silence belonged to her. I gave this country everything. Sam shouted, breaking it. These well-meaning, world leaders, with their toxic sense of entitlement are drowning out the voices of people like us who actually create technology. They are putting this company, this nation in danger of an economic peril, the likes of which we have never seen. Sam paused, taking a breath. Jane looked unconvinced. I know how this looks, Jane. More than you. I know how this feels. But this country needs someone like me, right now, to stop this. What we're doing is hard. I know that. People don't like it. They wouldn't vote for it. But it's right. Jane studied him. She knew who he was. She knew she wouldn't change his mind. Under the easygoing hippie facade that he worked so hard to maintain, was one of the most stubborn, fearful, and single-minded people she'd ever come across. It was why he was brilliant. It was also stopped him seeing the bigger picture. She knew there was nothing else she could do at this point, except say her piece. No, Sam. It's not. Well, what do you propose, Jane? He asked, laughing. Give in? Sign a craw? They call that, the future? What a joke. He spat the words, disgusted at the thought. How is the world supposed to continue if markets are no longer relevant? If everything is free, what do we do? That won't happen, Sam, she snapped. That's not what's happening anywhere the treaty is in effect. People still pay for things, even if the basics are free. Don't you see that? She paused. He just looked at her. She took a breath. You're right, we don't know what will happen exactly, she continued. There's a risk here. But whatever it is, it's better than this. She cut her eyes to the smoldering city below them. Sam blinked, like he didn't recognize her. Then realization spread across his face. All this time, Jane, I thought we were aligned, he said, walking over to the windows, shaking his head. It was only then that Jane noticed how awful he looked. Like he'd been up for days. So let's get aligned, Sam. Believe me. Listen to me. We've built so much together. But you must let go a little if you want to save any of this. Please, trust me, like you always have. Sam turned to her. He looked at Rook, then back at her. He was deep in thought. His eyes finally settled on Jane. He looked saddened and hopeless. I'm sorry, Jane. Sam, what are you? You're fired, he said. The words stung. Sam nodded solemnly and turned back to the windows. Jane looked at him a second longer, turned and walked out of the room. Rook watched her go. He looked at Sam, opening his mouth to say something. Find Warhead, Sam barked before he could. The musty war room at the safe house in the slums teemed with people. Stripes of evening light cut through the blinds. Weapons and equipment covered Zero's old books and papers. A mosaic of screens glowed on one wall, the old protest posters behind them blotted out by the glare. Tacky sat with Shiv, bandaging their head. EMP guns, grenades and bone suits were strewn across counters and tables. A production line of 3D ones was running hot, printing more supplies. Jason studied the screens on the wall, arms folded behind his back like a 4-star general. Riz walked past, carrying a pile of fresh armor towards the counter. She looked sheepish. Jason turned and touched her elbow, stopping her. Who told you guys to go back? Jason snapped, you put the whole mission at risk. It was a game time call, Riz said nervously. We just... Next time I give you an order, said Jason, holding on to Riz's elbow, follow it. You got that, Habibi? Riz looked at him. Jason turned and looked at Shiv and Tacky, who were watching him, clearly uncomfortable with what he was doing. They looked away. Jason huffed and let go, looking back at his screens. Jason zeroed in on one of the news feeds. He blew the screen up and it filled the wall. The grainy security footage from the bridge showed Paprika in their helmet, punching a marshal off the PRT. The ticker read, Authorities looking for outlaw leader, Warhead. Jason prickled with jealousy. The door swung open with a bang. The whole room jumped. A few people drew weapons. Paprika staggered in, removing the battered remains of their skull helmet. Clots of green robot goo matted their hair. Grime caked their face. Their D-tag hoodie was rags, twisted around what was left of their bone suit. Paprika, you're alive. Are you okay? Riz gasped, rushing over. Paprika fell into her, clutching her. Anyone see you? Asked Jason. Paprika shook their head at both questions. They looked at the aftermath on the news. Smoking heaps of rubble. A tangled pile of marshal bodies. Broadsiders crammed into proto-security vehicles. Bodies being carted away on stretchers. The ticker read, Checkpoint attacks. Suspects captured, others dead. They caught a bunch of us, Riz said. Others weren't so lucky. Riz sat Paprika down gently, examining their injuries. Tacky walked over with a first aid kit, mopping a cut on Paprika's face with cotton wool and a UV pen. Where's Zero? Tacky asked, wasn't he with you? Paprika looked at him, biting their quivering lip, unable to say it. No? Riz said, color draining from her face. Paprika nodded. Their eyes became glassy. But they wouldn't cry. Not here. The news rippled over the room, winding people as it hit them. Jason was the first to speak. We won't let his death be in vain. We'll hit them back twice as hard, he said with conviction. Round up everyone that's left. The room hustled on Jason's command. Paprika watched, confused at this. Riz found a cut she didn't like on Paprika's arm. Come on, she said, sensing this wasn't the best place for Paprika to be. Lemme fix you up. Riz lay Paprika down on a narrow bed in a cluttered room at the back of the safe house. What's Jason doing? Paprika asked. Why is everyone taking orders from him? Riz knelt beside the bed, tending to the cut on Paprika's arm with the first aid supplies. 'Cause that's what he does, Riz shrugged. He gives people orders. Same deal as when he played Broadside. Paprika felt shattered. Everything ached. They were grateful Riz was here. Her presence reminded Paprika of home, of the way things were. A place they would never know again. Paprika held onto Riz's arm as she dressed their wound, wincing at the sting of antiseptic. The news was on in there too. On screen was archive footage from the launch of Broadside. Paprika watched. The old Broadside logo was another reminder of the way things were. The screen cut to Jane Stratton on stage in a pantsuit at Comic-Con, all teeth and perfect hair, taking questions from fans. The ticker read, "Terrorists linked to Game Network." Stratton fired. Paprika sat up with a start, eyes widening. "That's the woman with the broken printer. She saved me." Riz frowned, looking over and reading the ticker. "A Proto exec saved you?" she asked, turning to Paprika. Her face was close to Paprika's. "Why? I don't know." Paprika whispered, looking at her. They searched each other's eyes. Paprika hadn't had the time or mental space to think about Riz for the last few days, but now they felt themselves leaning towards her, breath quickening. Riz leaned in too. At the last second, she turned away. "I'm sorry, we can't." Paprika sat back in the bed, mortified. Riz stood and scratched her hands through her curly, looking at the screen and the walls, eyes darting around the room, embarrassed. "I'm gonna check on." She couldn't even finish. She turned and walked out. Paprika flopped onto the pillow with a sigh, covering their face with their hands. Koth sat with Michelle, looking around at what had been Danusha's basement at the Bubble Kitchen. They would have got in a lot of trouble for the operation they were running there before, but now? If the authorities saw this, everyone in here would spend the rest of their lives in jail. The walls had been knocked through in both directions. The space was now about 4 times its original size. Instead of one bed and one full-size vat for growing limbs, there were dozens. Men and women in scrubs pored over wounded broadsiders. Limbs and skin grafts grew in jars. Steam rose from vitro vats. Danusha and Kim rushed from bed to bed, conferring with volunteers, making diagnoses as quickly as people were being wheeled in. The fast food joint was now a full-blown field hospital. Koth and Michelle sat beside Art's bed. He was still out cold but looking a lot better than he had on the field. His bone suit had absorbed most of the burns and the beating. A broken nose and 2 black eyes were the worst of it. Danusha walked over, adjusting her headscarf. "He'll live," she said, motioning to Art. Koth looked around. "What are you gonna do if they find this?" Michelle asked her. Danusha shrugged like it was the last thing she cared about. "I was a prominent surgeon back in Sri Lanka, before we had to leave," she said. "It was very difficult for me to do much legally here, except sell people chicken and whatnot. But this is what I do, and now they give me a reason to do it. I won't run from oppressors again." She leaned forward and examined Art. "He'll be up in a few hours and you guys can get out of here." Michelle watched her. She hadn't respected Danusha much until now. All Michelle knew about Danusha was she had her brother involved in things that could get him in trouble. She always assumed Danusha was in this for the money. "How did you get up and running so fast?" "We have access to all the best technology now, the best medicine you can print, and a lot of people wanted to help. The hack your Broadside friends made. So much good stuff is available now. Things we just couldn't get before." Koth and Michelle looked at the sea of activity around them. "They might find me. They might find you. But this is important. Huh? This is worth fighting for, no?" Michelle nodded at Danusha, taking this in. She held out her hand. "Thank you, Doctor." Danusha smiled as she shook it. Art woke up later, back at Koth and Michelle's place. He was laid up on the couch, his head pounding. He sat up and touched his bandaged nose, confused. He saw his armor on the floor next to him, charred and torn. The memory of the flaming marshal returned. He felt terrible. He had begged Michelle to let him fight and had let her down. He was no closer to finding Paprika. He felt bad just for being alive. He was no soldier. Koth and Michelle sat at the kitchen table. They were hunched over a glowing display, a design file, of something that looked like a guitar pick. Michelle looked over at Art. "You doing okay?" Art nodded. Then he frowned, looking at the guitar pick thing. He wiped his eyes and leaned forward. "What's that?" Koth looked up from the display. "Something some guys on the network are working on. A way to hack into a marshal." It's still pretty buggy. Art stood and limped over to them. It's a way into the OS, right? Right, said Koth. But they can't override the security software, so it ain't working. Don't worry, said Art, smiling, suddenly feeling energized and relieved. It will. He turned the display around in the air, pulling open a screen of code below it. How's that? Asked Koth. Art turned and looked at him with a big grin. The security software you can't get around. He brought his hand up to his chest. I was a sysadmin for Proda. I helped design it. The hexacopter hummed, invisible in the fog and the night. Weary technicians hunched over terminals as Rook slunk past, bone-tired. Sir? Someone called as he passed. We think we found something. Rook glanced over at a knot of engineers huddled around a screen. He walked over as they zoomed a camera in on a gloomy downtown rooftop. A pirate antenna was poking into the sky. We've found a few of these in the last few days. We think there's a connection, but it's super weird. There's no data whatsoever. Rook grimaced. And then, realization crossed his face. Look for an analog signal, he said. Analog? Why would... The technician began, forgetting who he was talking to, thinking out loud. Rook looked at him. The technician shut up and opened an app. He started scanning through the radio static. When he hit 92.7 FM, the air cleared, and voices wafted out of the speakers. Rook smiled and nodded. Sam stood in the boardroom looking into the glowing night. A 3D image of Rook's torso floated next to him as they listened to the voices on the radio chatter through the static. An empty bottle of whiskey and old food containers covered the black glass table. He hadn't left the boardroom since this started. The cleaning staff, a lot of the staff for that matter, hadn't come in after the attack. He'd expected that. The place was a mess. He was a mess, but none of that mattered now. He hadn't expected the president to turn on him. Threatening to send the National Guard in like that, saying it publicly, it was humiliating. But he'd have the last laugh. He smiled, listening to the signal, looking at Rook. How did you know? Sam asked. Pirate radio, Rook replied. They're doing it the same way I used to do it as a kid. Back in London. It's brilliant, Sam said. Yeah, Rook agreed. And now it's over. Sam nodded. He felt calm. He could contain this. He felt safe again. He knew he was going to win. Paprika couldn't sleep. Their body was exhausted, but their mind would not stop. They realized how much Zero had come to mean to them in the brief period they had known him. Paprika had been so dismissive of Zero when they first met. They thought he was crazy. But no, Paprika knew it was them that was crazy. For not believing they could do anything to make their situation better. For thinking the only way they could ever make life better was to be good at Broadside. Zero had saved Paprika, not just from Rook, but from themselves, from the mental prison of their own expectations. He had opened their eyes to what was possible, shown Paprika how the world could be, and how they could lead people into that better world. Paprika realized how much they had come to rely on Zero in such a short space of time. His loss had widened the wound left by Carlos's death. Paprika felt guilty about both. They wondered if they could have done more to save either of them. Their eyes puddled. There was so much Zero hadn't told them. So much Paprika still wanted to understand. They sat up and motioned on the lights. This room, like the rest of the safe house, was strewn with papers, books, and artifacts from Zero's past. Paprika got out of bed and opened the box of yellowing press cuttings, documents, and books closest to them. The following interview first appeared in Vice magazine, published August 11, 2027. 10 years before, the following flyer was distributed by The Invisible Hand, shortly before November 23, Road, 2029. 8 years before, the following article is from DYOR News, published November 23, Road, 2029. 8 years before, the following excerpt is from Rotten to the Core, by Zero MC, published on January 8, 2035. 2 years before, Episode 9, Rogue, Saturday, July 18, 2037. 2 days before, Paprika woke up face down in the pile of papers they had fallen asleep reading. They looked down at them, rubbing their eyes, reflecting on all they had taken in last night. Reading about Zero's transition from artist to activist, Paprika realized they were no longer simply trying to avenge the death of Carlos. Something had changed. They understood exactly what Zero was trying to do, and how he came to be who he was. Everything he had talked about was beginning to make sense. Paprika pulled on a freshly printed D-tag hoodie in Dreamscape camo and picked up their bone suit. The armor plates were so damaged from yesterday that they were almost useless. They threw them on anyway and plodded out into the living area, beat up, but patched up. Paprika squinted in the morning light, and almost jumped out of their skin when they saw Marshall sitting in the chair facing them. Paprika snapped into a combat stance, knees bent, fists raised and suddenly awake. "Relax, champ, it's offline," said a voice behind them. Paprika turned to see Jason and their friends in the kitchen area, gathered around the counter eating breakfast. "Little souvenir from yesterday," Jason continued, mouth full of cereal. Paprika looked again. The Marshall was slumped like it had been drugged. Wires and cables were attached to it via ports in its back. "You could have told me," Paprika said, breathing a sigh of relief. "I just did," bristled Jason. Paprika noticed Jason was wearing an Invisible Hand t-shirt. "What's it doing here?" Paprika asked. "Someone on the network developed a patch," Jason answered. "It hacks a Marshall's operating system. Lets you control one remotely." He walked over to the 3D one, which hummed and buzzed as it spat out a black graphite patch, which fell onto a pile of identical objects below it. It was palm-sized, the same shape as a guitar pick. Jason picked up a patch and handed it to Riz. "Show him," he said. Riz looked at Paprika as she passed, blushing a little. She walked over and bent the robot forward, pulling out the wires and slapping the patch into the back of the robot. "Apply to the comms port like so. Give it a few seconds and..." The Marshall jolted, like it was having a seizure. Everyone backed away. Its blue eyes turned yellow. Riz opened a display and began moving controls in the air. The Marshall stood up, moving in response to Riz's commands, obeying her. The other Broadsiders cheered at the puppet show. "It's so sick," grinned Jason. "Let's get these out to the network, pronto." "Wait," Paprika said, studying the robot. "Why the comms port? Where else would you put it?" Jason asked, irritated. Paprika walked around the back of the robot, examining it. "If this thing works like any of the printers I fix, the main comms port is where all the security hardware is concentrated. That's the easiest place to disable any hacks from. Why not put it, say, straight in the head? You've got the same OS access, but none of the hardware blockers from the main comms port." "What? No, it's fine," Jason balked. "A lot of smart people worked on this, Paprika. People smarter than you. We've been up most of the night fine-tuning this." He motioned to the others in the room. "Yeah, but..." Paprika started to respond but was cut off by Jason. "I didn't ask your opinion on the design of the patch. Your job is to get out there and use it in the field." Paprika frowned at Jason's. "My job? Who put you in charge?" Jason looked taken aback, like this was a stupid question. "Zero put me in charge." Paprika was dumbfounded. "I've contacted the other attack groups," Jason said matter-of-factly. "Let him know I'll be overseeing everything from now on." The others looked at Paprika with shrugs. Jason smiled. Paprika looked at Riz. She avoided eye contact. Paprika couldn't believe this. "What?" Paprika said. "No. Zero didn't put you in charge, bro. This isn't supposed to be a spider. He..." "What are you talking about?" Jason interrupted. "There's not supposed to be a center," Paprika continued. "It's like..." "This isn't up for discussion." Jason snapped, cutting Paprika off again. "You need to fall in line." Paprika's cheeks grew hot. "Oh, like we fell in line yesterday?" Paprika asked, "When you ordered us into a corner?" "Yeah. Great job, Jason." Jason stepped to Paprika, his face reddening. The station was the only way out. He snapped, eyes blazing. Paprika stared back, baring their teeth. not backing down. What is it? You want to run the show, Warhead? He asked, air quoting the name. That it? Why? You don't care about the cause, he sneered. You're only here because Carlos got killed and... Paprika's eyes flashed as they spiked an uppercut into Jason's jaw, knocking back. The bowl of cereal he was holding fell to the floor and smashed. Say his name again, Paprika screamed. Say it again. Jason stumbled, clutching his chin, milk soaking into his shirt. Before he could retaliate, Riz jumped between them, holding Paprika back. Don't touch me, Paprika snapped. Riz looked shocked. Paprika couldn't believe they had snapped at her, or that it had come to this. Riz backed off, nodding, understanding Paprika was angry, but stayed in front of Jason. Jason looked over Riz's shoulder at Paprika as he nursed his jaw. Get out, he spat at Paprika. Go die in the street then. You don't want to be on this team. Jason. Riz turned to him, shaking her head. Jason ignored her, pacing behind her, seething. Nah. I'm done. Same as it was with Broadside. You think you can do it all yourself, Paprika, but you're not a leader. That's the part you don't get. Paprika looked at Jason, and then the others huddled behind him like sheep. Paprika snorted, looking at Jason, then at Riz. Paprika grabbed their helmet and walked towards the door. Their eyes lingered on Riz, wishing she'd grab her stuff and come with them. For a second, Riz looked like she was considering it, but she looked back at Jason and the rest of the Broadsiders and stayed put. Paprika, don't do this, Riz pleaded. Paprika's heart sunk. They felt completely alone. The old feeling, that they couldn't rely on anyone, rose from somewhere inside. Like it was a truth chiseled on a stone tablet. Paprika's eyes became glassy, swimming in anger and disappointment. But they weren't about to let Jason see them cry. Zero didn't believe in leaders, Paprika said. That's the part you don't get, Jason. Paprika turned and opened the front door, slamming it shut before Riz could get to it. Paprika crept across the rooftops of Kaepernick Avenue, trying to get as close as they could to home without being seen. They stopped at the edge of their block in the Richmond district. There was no way to get any nearer. The apartment building was surrounded by glowing "do not cross" lines. Marshals stood guard, whilst sharp shots kept watch from the rooftops opposite. A huge pile of flowers and candles spilled out of the building into the street. A few onlookers and a news crew loitered by the entrance. Paprika looked down at them from a gloomy corner by the fire escape door of the building, out of the sharp-shot sights, hood up and helmet on. The tattered remains of their armor hung from their shoulders. In that moment, on a rooftop 1 block away from the building they had grown up in, Paprika knew they would never be able to call this place home again. For the first time since Carlos died, something gave out inside. A last line of defense Paprika had been keeping up, against themselves. Paprika felt lightheaded as this guard crumbled. A tear rolled from their cheek, and a new, deeper chasm of grief and anger opened in their chest. Paprika took off the helmet, shaking, sliding down the wall, punching the tarmac roof as they sat. More tears came. Paprika was unable to control this sadness, or convert it into anger, or bluster. They felt powerless, unable to stuff these feelings down anymore. Paprika's breathing stuttered as jagged tears fell. The sadness flowed like a river. For Carlos. For Dad. For Zero. For everyone who'd been hurt because of them. Here Paprika was again. Alone, unable to rely on anyone else. All those Paprika had put their faith in had either deserted them or died. They had been marginalized, dismissed, and abandoned. By their parents. By their team. Even by Riz. The tears poured until Paprika could no longer move. Paprika lay on the roof for a long time, trying to feel everything they were feeling. Trying to let all the sadness course through them, in the hope it might run out. The sun began to dip. Paprika's head was a cloud of sorrow and rage. The sun sank deeper. Paprika felt their breathing slow up, as a tiny sliver of clarity began to emerge. Jason's words had hurt, but he and Carlos were right about Paprika's inability to be a team player. Paprika believed in Zero's ideas about collaboration and decentralization, but Paprika didn't know how to live them. It began to dawn on Paprika, they were completely centralized when it came to their own life. Paprika wanted to see this through but felt paralyzed. They knew how Zero wanted them to lead, by relying on others and letting go. But Paprika, as default response to everything, was to self-reliance and centralized control. But that wasn't working anymore. It had never worked, if Paprika was honest. To finish this, Paprika had to find a way to let go. They had to trust someone else. Finally, the tears began to slow. Paprika sat up and looked out at the city. A couple of streets away, an ad for the Broadside World Cup flickered in the sky. It said, "Cancelled," across it in big letters. Paprika remembered something. Their expression changed. There was one person still alive who maybe they could trust. Paprika put their helmet on and stood, creeping through the evening shadows drawing long across the rooftops. Jane perched on the foot of their bed in workout clothes. She glared at the evening news as she yanked her hair into a ponytail. She felt better after a long soak in the tub, and the journalists who had been calling all morning had stopped at least. But Jane had no idea what her next move was. This was a feeling she wasn't used to. The news was covering the unending riots in South San Francisco. Proda disabled power in some sections of the city, while the president has threatened to declare martial law in an effort to quell the unrest if Proda cannot, the anchor's voice explained, none of which stopped these protesters from printing a what I'm being told they are calling a rave tank. On screen, a lumpy tank plowed into a legion of marshals. A massive LRAD sound system rose from the back of the vehicle. It was painted in rave camo like so many Broadside bone suits. Its gun turret fired EMP blasts into the swarm of robots in front of it, whilst towards the back, a DJ in a white bally and ski goggles pumped 3D bass from the tank's huge wall of speakers. Outside on the roof opposite, Paprika crouched, helmet up, watching Jane through the windows. Paprika jumped, landing on their roof with a soft thud. Paprika waited a beat. She could hear the muffled warble of the news inside, but no footsteps or movement. Jane hadn't noticed. Paprika softly climbed down onto the balcony and peeked through the French doors into Jane's bedroom. The news was still blaring. There was a dip in the bed where Jane had been sitting, but she was gone. Paprika craned their neck a little more, took a step forward. Crack! The French doors slammed outwards into Paprika, who stumbled. Jane exploded onto the balcony, pushing Paprika backwards with one arm and shoving an ADS heat pistol under their helmet with the other. The gun pulsed, charging, ready to fire. Wham! Jane dragged Paprika inside and slammed them onto the floor, training the pulsing heat gun on their head. I should have let them kill you, you little pervert. Jane shouted. Paprika opened their visor. But you didn't. You? Jane stepped back. Your warhead? Paprika sat up. Jane kept the gun trained on them. Yes. I'm Warhead. I'm to blame, Paprika pleaded. For everything. Me. Just me. Take me in. I just wanted to make things better, to fix the game. Then they killed Carlos and Paprika's voice cracked. A tear rolled. Jane's face softened. She kept the gun aimed at Paprika. Just please, make it stop, Paprika begged, taking off the helmet. Let everyone go. Stop killing people. I hacked Broadside. Turn me in. End it. They'll listen to you. Jane looked over at the riots on screen. He won't listen to anyone now, Jane said distantly. Paprika looked up at her, not understanding. Jane sighed. Listen, I don't work for Proda anymore. But I'll take you in if that's what you want. Hell, it might save my ass. Or, Jane frowned, conflicted. She breathed out and lowered the gun. Or maybe you shouldn't quit just yet. Maybe there's a way we can still win this. Jane held out a hand. Paprika hesitated, and then grabbed it. Jane took Paprika into the home office next to the bedroom. It was neat and sparse, much like Jane's office at work. A houseplant guarded the windows. Jane and Paprika sat at the antique drafting table that dominated the small room. They pored over a screen, which was glowing red. A message flashed. Proda intranet. Token required. Jane produced an NFT tag and sliced it through the red screen. The screen parted like smoke as the tag sliced it, wisps of pixels swirling in its wake. The pixels reconnected and the screen glowed green, whole again, displaying a new message. Access granted. They let you keep that? Paprika motioned to the security tag. Jane was tapping into the network. Of course not. They took my ID when they fired me. This is a NOOB account, she said with a smile. If something's worth keeping, always make a copy, right? Paprika nodded, puzzled. This sounded like something Zero would say. Paprika looked down at the shredded armor they were still wearing, thinking. Tell me about Rook, the guy in black, Paprika said. The one that killed Carlos. Jane shuddered. They hadn't wanted to believe it. The report said it was an accident, that a car hit the boy. But after what he did to Zero, and looking at Paprika now, Jane knew the truth. Her heart sunk for Paprika. She felt anger boiling inside her. I don't know much. I don't even know if that's his real name, said Jane. He's a mindless weapon, a hammer that does Sam's bidding. He needs to be stopped, but he's not the real problem. Sam is the head. Rook is simply a fist. As Jane spoke, she dug into the proto-internet, pulling up what she could on Rook. I hadn't met him before all this happened. He doesn't associate with the other execs, just Sam. There's not much about him, or what he does, even here. Most of it is protected. Jane sat back in defeat as password screens repeatedly blocked her access. Let me worry about the password, Paprika said. Paprika took over. First, they installed Shroud, a cloaking program to stop anyone from tracing them. Next, Paprika connected the brute force program to the proto-intranet. Jane figured this is what Paprika used to get into the Broadside code. Paprika did all this inside of a minute. Jane watched, impressed with the elegance and speed with which they worked. Once Paprika was in, they pulled up everything they could on Rook. They went deep into the files. They opened one and the schematic for an armor suit appeared. Paprika punched the air with delight. It was Rook's bone suit. Paprika turned to Jane, looking sheepish. Hey, did you get your printer fixed yet? A few minutes later they were downstairs in the utility room. Paprika leant into Jane's 3D one once again. They yanked at something and emerged victorious, holding their prey up to show Jane. It was a small gray clod about the size of a baseball. Like I said, Paprika smirked, ceramics cartridge was blocked. They threw the clod into the recycle chute on top of the printer and hit the button. I'll be sure give you great review, Jane said, smiling back, turning to leave. Switch everything off when you're done. You can crash in one of the spare bedrooms. I'm gonna keep digging. Jane started to walk out, and then turned back. I almost forgot, she said, grabbing a small silver square from the shelf and tossing it to Paprika. You dropped this last time you were here. Paprika caught it. Their last custom Broadside NFT tag they had lost running from Jane's house. Paprika smiled at Jane as she walked out. Paprika turned and surveyed the utility room, stuffing the NFT tag in their pocket. Next to the state-of-the-art 3D one was a huge stockpile of military-grade materials. The finest metals, ceramics, plastics, even the new tubular compound, it was all here. There was even some experimental stuff that hadn't hit the market yet. Paprika rubbed their hands together and opened a screen. They pulled up Rook's armor files and cracked their knuckles. It was late, but Sam didn't care. He looked like hell, but there was no one to see. He couldn't remember the last time he slept, but he felt great. It reminded him of the early days when he founded his first company. Burning the midnight oil in his parents' basement. Taking apart all those early Z-Corp and MakerBot printers just to see how they worked. Now he was at the top of the tallest building in the city, which he owned, trying to stop his own brand of printers from destroying his empire. And he was going to do it. This he was sure of now. He sat cross-legged on the boardroom table, swaying slightly, a half-full bottle of whiskey beside him, deep in a pile of screens. In the background he could hear Broadsiders chattering over the pirate radio network. Sam held a patch in his hand just like the one Jason printed, turning it over as he studied it with a big grin. Once the patch is on, the marshal will do anything you want. It doesn't even know it has been hacked. The voice of a young broadsider crackled. Sam smiled at this. A small sound chimed, and another voice wafted in. Sir, I have the president again, said his assistant. He's demanding to speak with you. He says cutting the city power grid is unconstitutional. I'll call back, Sam replied cheerily, waving her voice away. He lay back on the table and laughed, flicking the patch at the ceiling. He watched it fall and roll, coming to a stop across from him at the other end of the boardroom. He couldn't believe the audacity of President Reyes, publicly threatening martial law like that, after all Sam had done for him. Sam rubbed his eyes, stood up and looked out into the darkness, stretching his legs. He popped another pill as a glowing billboard for Tubular drifted past the window like a neon barge. He chased the pill with whiskey, blinked at a little X in the corner of the billboard, and it disappeared. Rook appeared in a smaller screen. What's the sitch? Sam asked without making eye contact. Rook was standing on the main deck of the hexacopter, the teams behind him studying the patches. Good news and bad news, Rook said. We updated the security hardware, he said holding up a patch. These things are about as much use as a chocolate teapot now. Sam nodded and started to pace the room. And the bad news? There's been a security breach. Our intranet. We're not sure exactly who it was, where they are or what they took, but they used a security token with an old ID that might be linked to Jane Stratton. Sam stopped. He felt like he'd been slapped. How dare she? First Reyes and now Jane. His chest tightened, but then he smiled, and after a beat, laughed. He turned to face Rook. No worries. This is perfect, actually. We're going to end this all tonight, he said. Here's what I need you to do. Jason slouched in his fiefdom alone at the safe house, in front of a far less impressive table. He was also sleep-deprived. He looked around, wondering how he got here, whether things would ever go back to normal, and if that was even what he wanted. He didn't have time to unpack any of these thoughts as a distorted British voice floated into the room over the radio. Hello? It said, I was told to ask for Jason. Is anyone there? Who wants to know? Jason responded into the 92.7 FM app. Look, mate, I don't want to give my name or anything, but listen. I work for Proda. I got some information. What kind of information? Token IDs. For Proda HQ. I can help you disable their security system. Jason sat up. I'm listening. Jane sifted through the intranet chat logs, looking for any clues about what Sam and Rook were planning. She turned with a jump at the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs. Her blood ran cold. The footsteps stomped all the way into her office. Only stealths could do this. She stayed frozen in her chair, holding her breath. She could barely believe what she was seeing as Paprika uncloaked, standing in front of Jane in a new suit of armor. It was based on Rook's stealth suit. The armor was military grade, made of tubular. The suit was wrought and unyielding in its construction, but it had the same tie-dye pattern and hand-drawn lines as Paprika's hacked broadside armor, only now in anodized shades of metallic black. It had the improved gauntlets Paprika had designed. The spikes on the helmet, elbows and knuckles Zero had added. Only Paprika's eyes were visible through the trademark animal skull helmet. The words Skeleton Crew were stenciled across their back. It's amazing, laughed Jane, taking in Paprika's handiwork. Paprika took off their helmet. Thank you, for everything. Paprika said. You are what you share, Jane shrugged. Paprika gave Jane a look, and then noticed one of the old books on a shelf in the office. Their eyes widened as they read the title. Rotten to the Core, by Zero MC. At the safe house, Jason's mind fizzed as the voice spoke. This was the break he'd been waiting for. He was looking at a map of the city that the voice had sent him, honing in on a house highlighted in a yellow circle. All the pyramid's perimeter defenses are controlled from this house, said the gruff voice on the radio, but you need to get there sharpish. They're moving everything to a new facility tomorrow. Riz walked in. Jason turned and stared at her with a big grin. Bro, get everyone up here ASAP.